Hi, I'm Tina Bland. I recently found out that the family I lived in for 17 years is not my own. It turns out that my biological parents are raising someone else's child. I was changed at birth in the hospital. I found out about it by accident. My current parents always told the story of our family. The family was noble, even if only in their own city, but we were considered the most well off. My father was proud of the family tree, as well as a small business that was passed down from generation to generation, the business of producing home preserves. They always turned out to be the most delicious thanks to an old recipe. That's what we were famous for. My father loved me very much, but he always wanted a son to leave the business to the heir. And my mother gave birth to a daughter, and her, that is, I was named Tina Bland. My mother tried to get pregnant again and again. She was endlessly treated, took medication, but she could not get pregnant. Later, Dad accepted it. Thus, I became the sole heiress of the Bland family. Now imagine what it was like for parents, especially for Dad, to find out that the daughter he had raised for so many years, preparing to continue the business, was not really his daughter. In general, if not for an accident, we would never have found out about it, and life would have gone on as usual. One weekend, my friend Stella and I decided to go cycling around the city. The weather was beautiful and sunny. Stella had put on her gear, a helmet, knee pads, and protective gloves, and I didn't want to ruin my hair with that stupid helmet, so I decided to go without it. We were planning to have a little picnic in the park, but as we turned the corner of the street, a motorcyclist drove by. I was lucky that it had very little speed. I got a little bruised head when I fell over the ground. The guy took me straight to the hospital and called my parents. I was placed in a room with an old woman. It turned out that she worked in this clinic for a long time. I was an obstetrician. I delivered babies. It was a wonderful job. Being able to see a new life being born is great. I have delivered hundreds of babies, and each one is unique, she told me as I received the IV. Then the old woman said that in her life, there were situations that she still regrets because she took on too much responsibility and accepted someone's fate. I have been living in fear ever since. I haven't told anyone about this except you. I haven't been able to sleep at night without having nightmares since. If I had my will, I would have turned back the clock and not allowed this to happen, a neighbor in the ward told me. I didn't know why she was sharing it with me. She must be very lonely, I thought. By this time, a nurse had entered the room. Tina Bland, your parents are waiting for you in the hallway. They have already spoken to the doctor. Your drip will soon run out, she told me. My mother looked into the room with tears, waved, and said she was waiting. The old woman suddenly got up from the bed, her face covered with an incomprehensible grimace. It feels like she's scared or anxious. She looked at me in horror. I didn't know what was going on, but she scared me. Tina, bubbling? She asked, stuttering. Yes, I said. Then Granny said my mother's name. I asked her how she knew us. The old woman began to cry a lot and carry some nonsense, something like she is sorry and this sin haunts her all her life. Then she looked me in the eye and told me that after that incident, she no longer worked at this hospital. I could not stand it and asked what's such a case. Then Grandma calmed down, took a deep breath, and said, I switched you at birth, she told me. What? I thought. She began to frighten me. I shouted if she was in her right mind, who she was and what kind of nonsense she was talking. Then my mother ran into the room, hearing the screams. The old woman threw herself at her feet and begged for forgiveness. Mom yanked the IV out of my hand and took it home. She told me on the way home that she knew the old woman's face. That grandmother still reminded me of myself. A few days later, she came to our house. We sent her away at first. Then she said that she found our address in the hospital when I was discharged. Then she identified herself as the obstetrician who delivered my mother and repeated that she had changed babies. According to her, she did it intentionally. She was allegedly asked to do this by a woman who had a daughter. Her husband said that she should give birth to a son, otherwise he promised to drive her and the child out of the house. The woman begged, she cried, said that she has 3 daughters and the 4th will only make her husband angry, the doctor said. According to her, that day my mother gave birth to a boy. The doctor tossed around for a long time, did not know what to do, but she was sure that my parents would accept a child of any gender and decided to help the poor woman. Telling this, my grandmother was very penitent. She cried and begged me to forgive her. Of course, my parents and I were in shock, and this is an understatement. My father was ready to go to the police, but I felt sorry for her. She is already old and has lived for 17 years regretting what she did. As a result, when the emotion subsided, the parents said they would forgive her if they found their son's address. She fulfilled her promise, and within a week, we were on the doorstep of the house where I would have lived. An exhausted woman opened the door to us, but her husband left her anyway and left the family, leaving 4 children. My brother, as the only man in the house, was already earning a living at age 17, helping his sisters. That woman loved him. When she saw us, at first she didn't understand what was happening, but then she remembered that old lady, her doctor. In short, there was a long conversation between 2 families. It ended with her asking for forgiveness and saying that if it wasn't for her son, she would have died long ago, since he is her main support. Only he stood up for her when her husband beat her. My mother was crying. At some point, I was afraid. I thought that now the parents will want to take their son instead of me, especially the father. But my parents said that no matter what, I'm still their daughter. My kind of brother stayed with my mother, said that he loved her, and I stayed with my parents for the same reason. But since then, we have been in close contact with our families, and my father employed all those children in his factory.
Hi guys, my name is Matthew. In life, sometimes unthinkable things happen, and people do not deliberate their actions. I want to tell you about how my foster parents sold me to my mom for $500,000. This phrase sounds absurd, but believe me, this happens in life. I hope my story will serve as a lesson to many. My story started from my birth. My mother got pregnant when she was only 17, naturally by accident. As she says, the father was her age and afraid of responsibility and disappeared somewhere. And she didn't have any relatives, so she grew up as an orphan. And so she had to face this problem, so to speak, one-on-one. I understand that it was not easy for her, because she was in fact still a child, and she didn't have a lot of money. The only solution was to leave me in an orphanage. But as you know, children are not well looked after there. Any mother wishes her child a good life, and she decided to take a dangerous and illegal step. She found a couple on the internet named Emma and Daniel, and right after I was born, she sold me to them for $1,000. So I didn't even know for a long time who my parents really were. Emma had problems with infertility. Doctors diagnosed her that she could not have any children. At first, they seemed to love me very much and treated me like their native child. They bought me everything new, took me to different entertainment places, and took care of my education. Everything seemed to be fine, right? But medicine does not stand still. Soon, when they found treatment for infertility, Emma was the first in line. A miracle happened and she was able to get pregnant. She also had a son named Michael. They were overjoyed. I do not know what happened, but with the birth of their own son, they began to treat me more rudely, not as their own biological child. At that time, I did not know that I was adopted, and so it was very strange for me why they treated me like this. They stopped paying attention to me. I even got used to the fact that I was often forgotten to be picked up from school. They took Michael to different courses while I started doing household chores after school at an early age. If Michael bought new toys, then his old and broken ones were given to me, and everything else like that. This cruel attitude towards me was manifested more and more every time. Over time, they began to scold me for the slightest mistake or fault. Every time I did something wrong, Daniel pulled out his leather belt. Of course, they were only trying to scare me, but I didn't even have to do anything wrong, or I could just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. When I turned 16, my parents said they were not going to pay for my studies anymore, and they did not care that I would drop out of school. But I didn't want to do that, so I had to get a job to somehow find money for the contract. Fortunately, the owner of the local fast food restaurant agreed to take me to work for half the rate. It gave me hope. I performed all the tasks that were given to me with great responsibility. After school, I immediately went to work and was there until night, every day. At first, I washed the dishes in the restaurant. Not to say that's a good job, but I liked the feeling that I could earn money on my own. After all, they say there is no bad work. Our team was also very friendly. It was even more pleasant to be there than at home. At least no one scolded me there, and my parents didn't even think of where I was or what I was doing. I think it was even easier for them that I wasn't home at all. Seeing my efforts, the chief decided to promote me and appointed me to a new position. I became a cashier and already took orders from guests. This was career growth, so to speak. I kept up with my studies. In my free time, I did my homework, so it was all right. But once I noticed that one woman began to frequent our fast food restaurant. She looked like she was well off, and for me, people like her rarely go to places like that. She only ordered coffee every day and could sit and watch me for hours. I couldn't figure out what she wanted from me, but I didn't dare ask. She also ordered only from me. Even when I was busy, she waited until I was free. You could say it even scared me. She watched my every move intently. You know how creepy it is if you're being watched all the time by someone you don't know? One day, I had to stay after work and clean the hall as a duty officer, and all the visitors had already left. But this woman didn't leave. When I went to warn her about the closing, she took my hand and asked me to sit down and talk. I was shocked by this, but I still sat down. She introduced herself as Linda and asked me to listen and understand. She said that she was my biological mother and told me how she went to such a step and, so to speak, sold me. After all, she was very young and helpless. But now she works for a prestigious firm and has a good home. And since the moment she lost me, she couldn't calm down about it and gave her word that no matter what, she would find me. My brain did not perceive this information, and I could not believe what she was saying, and this was nonsense. But at the time, I thought about it. The thought never left my mind. I decided to check with my parents, as it were, whether this was actually true. This news greatly surprised and angered them. Emma said that yes, it really was true. And if I want to, then I can go to her, but on one condition, that I will have to work and return all the money they spent on me since my childhood. Well, that's about $500,000. Well, until I could pay them, they took my documents. I hated being around them, so I packed my backpack and went to work. I wanted to pay the money as soon as possible and never see them again. I spent the night secretly at work, so the chief didn't know. I slept in the back room, and in the morning I went to school. Since the last conversation with Linda, she had stopped coming, and I hadn't seen her for a long time. But I really didn't care. I knew in my heart that this was my real mother. A week later, Emma called me and told me to come home immediately, but I didn't want to see them, so I turned off my phone so they wouldn't bother me, and quietly worked on. Whatever happened, I didn't care. Then Linda came to us one day. She had an envelope in her hand, and with tears in her eyes, she asked me to listen to her. She slipped me the envelope and told me that she took my documents and paid all the money that Emma and Daniel demanded from me. I was shocked because this is not a small amount. Unless she has such savings, in fact, it turned out that she sold her house, car, and even jewelry for this. But why, do you ask? Any mother would do anything for her child, and for Linda, it was not a pity to lose everything so long that her son did not suffer. She was very sorry that she sold me, and from that moment she realized her huge mistake. Now my biological mother and I live together, but in a rented apartment. I'm not used to calling her mom yet, but I try. But all this is not important because I really felt now what a mother's love is. In life, everything happens, and sometimes people do not deliberate and do terrible things. Share what interesting stories you had. Maybe something similar happened to your friends.